I'm dominating.
It's 2022, and there's one question on everyone's mind. How good of a fighter is Jon Snow, actually? This video topic came about because I kept encountering the idea that Jon Snow was some kind of uniquely badass fighter, or just somehow particularly skilled amongst fighters that we're introduced to within the book series. And I found this kind of strange. Yes, Jon Snow is a self-insert for the predominantly younger male audience. And yes, Jon Snow from the Game of Thrones show is shown as being a real badass sword fighter. But assumed badassery and epic portrayal in a bad dragon show, a Bamf Jon make not. So I thought we'd take some time to dive deeper into this question and find out just how badass Jon Snow really is.
Lord Snow here grew up in a castle, spitting down on the likes of you. Pip, do you think Ned Stark's bastard bleeds like the rest of us? Next! Next! Well, Lord Snow, it appears you're the least useless person here.
This is what you used to build me up? This is where you got all that stupid Katra stuff?
Oh, no, that's from Star Trek 3. The search for Spock.
Search for Spock?
Yeah, for me,
You doofus!
So I want to start off by putting things in perspective. Jon Snow is badass by compared to the average person. He spent his whole life training at arms in a castle. He's fought under a relatively skilled master at arms with an emphasis on real-world practical training. He fought against other skilled individuals, and he's been shown to easily hold his own against people who are untrained. Furthermore, Jon has shown skill and prowess against wildling fighters, and against many of the stronger, young, and skilled men at Castle Black. But, as stated, Jon had a castle upbringing. He trained under a knight, sparring with his brother and probably men-at-arms, other knights, northern warriors, and lords his whole life. Should we really expect anything different from Jon? Does this make Jon unique? Does this make Jon particularly badass? Does this make Jon any different from many of the squires and younger knights that have earned their spurs throughout Westeros? I mean, how would Jon stack up against, say, Loras Tyrell, someone who is put forth as a shining example of 16-year-old chivalry? The fact is that we should already expect Jon Snow to be good, but we shouldn't really expect him to be great. And we don't really get any examples that he is great. We get the example and idea that he is learning. And again, this isn't to disparage Jon's skill against lesser trained opponents. However, I think Donal Noye offers some great insight for us, the reader, when he's trying to give Jon some insight on his current standing and situation in Castle Black as in regards to the brothers he's beating up in the yard. Jon pulled himself to his feet. Donal Noye stood glowering at them. "The yard is for fighting," the armorer said. "Keep your quarrels out of my armory, or I'll make them my quarrels. You won't like that." Toad sat on the floor, gingerly feeling the back of his head. His fingers came away bloody. "He tried to kill me." "It's true, I saw it," one of the rapers put in. "He broke my wrist," Grin said again, holding it out to Noye for inspection. The armorer gave the offended wrist the briefest of glances. "A bruise, perhaps a sprain. Mace Damon will give you a salve. Go with him. Totta, that head wants looking after. The rest of you, return to your cells. Not you, Snow. You stay." Jon sat heavily on the long wooden bench as the others left, oblivious to the looks they gave him, the silent promises of future retribution. His arm was throbbing. "The Watch has need of every man it can get," Donal Noye said when they were alone. "Even men like Toad. You won't win any honors killing him." Jon's anger flared. "He said my mother was—" "Oh, I heard him. What of it?" "Lord Eddard Stark was not a man to sleep with whores," Jon said icily. "His honor did not prevent him from fathering a bastard, did it?" Jon was cold with rage. "Can I go?" You go when I tell you to go. Jon stared sullenly at the smoke rising from the brazier, until Noi took him under the chin, thick fingers twisting around his head. Look at me when I'm talking to you, boy. Jon looked. The armorer had a chest like a keg of ale, and a gut to match. His nose was flat and broad, and he always seemed in need of a shave. The left sleeve of his black woolen tunic was fastened at the shoulder with a silver pin in the shape of a longsword. Words won't make your mother a whore. She was what she was, and nothing Toad says can change that. You know we have men on the wall whose mothers were whores. Not my mother, Jon thought stubbornly. He knew nothing of his mother. Eddard Stark would not talk of her, yet he dreamed of her at times, so often that he could almost see her face. In his dreams, she was beautiful and highborn, and her eyes were kind. You think you had it hard, being a High Lord's bastard, the armorer went on. That boy Jared's a Septon's get, and Cotter Pike is the base-born son of a tavern wench. Now he commands East Watch by the sea. I don't care, Jon said. I don't care about them. I don't care about you, or Thorin, or Benjen Stark, or any of it. I hate it here. It's cold. Yes, cold and hard and mean. That's the wall and the men who walk it. Not like the stories your wet nurse told you. Well, piss on the stories your wet nurse told you, and piss on your wet nurse. This is the way it is. And you're here for life, like the rest of us. Life? Jon repeated bitterly. The armorer could talk about life. He had had one. He had only taken the black after he'd lost an arm at the siege of Storm's End. Before that, he'd smithed for Stannis Baratheon, the king's brother. He'd seen the 7 kingdoms from one end to the other. He'd feasted and winched and fought in 100 battles. They said that it was Donal Noy who'd forged King Robert's warhammer, the one that crushed the life from Rhaegar Targaryen on the Trident. He'd done all the things that Jon would never do, and then when he was old, well past 30, he'd taken a glancing blow from an axe and the wound had festered until the whole arm had to come off. Only then, crippled, had Donal Noy come to the wall, when his life was all but over. Yes, life, Noy said. A long life or a short one. It's up to you, Snow. The road you're walking, one of your brothers will slit your throat for you one night. They're not my brothers, Jon snapped. They hate me because I'm better than they are. No! They hate you because you act like you're better than they are. They look at you and see a castle-bred bastard who thinks he's a lordling. The armorer leaned close. You're no lordling. Remember that. You're a Snow, not a Stark. You're a bastard. And a bully. A bully? Jon almost choked on the word. The accusation was so unjust it took his breath away. They were the ones who came after me. 4 of them. 4 that you've humiliated in the yard. 4 who are probably afraid of you. I've watched you fight. It's not training with you. Put a good edge on your sword, and they'd be dead meat. You know it, I know it, they know it. You leave them nothing. You shame them. Does that make you proud? Jon hesitated. He did feel proud when he'd won. Why shouldn't he? But the armorer was taking that away too, making it sound like if he were doing something wrong. They're all older than me, he said defensively. Older, bigger, and stronger. That's the truth. I'll wager your master-at-arms taught you to fight bigger men at Winterfell, though. Who was he? Some old knight? Sir Roderick Cassel, Jon said warily. There was a trap here. He felt it closing around him. Donal Noy leaned forward into Jon's face. Now think of this, boy. None of these others have ever had a master-at-arms until Sir Alliser. Their fathers were farmers, and wagon men, and poachers, and smiths, and miners, and oars on a trading galley. What they know of fighting they learn between decks, and in the alleys of Old Town and Lannisport, in the wayside brothels and taverns on the King's Road. They may have clacked a few sticks together before they came here, but I promise you not 1 in 20 was ever rich enough to own a real sword. His look was grim. So how do you like the taste of your victories now, Lord Snow? And Jon doesn't like the taste of those victories. In fact, he turns it around and becomes friends with these people who become his cast of followers, and many of them endeared characters in the book series. And Jon Snow begins teaching them. Because again, Jon Snow is a far superior fighter to somebody who's never picked up a sword in their life. However, let's take a look at Jon Snow's own opinions about how he would fare in a sword fight against someone who is truly regarded as a legendary class sword fighter. And I am of course talking about Qhorin Halfhand. Valyrian steel, spell-forged and razor-sharp, nigh on indestructible. A swordsman should be as good as his sword, Sam. Longclaw is Valyrian steel, but I'm not. The Halfhand could have killed me as easily as you swat a bug. Sam handed back the sword. When I try to swat a bug, it always flies away. All I do is slap my arm. It stings. That made Jon laugh. As you will. Qhorin could have killed me as easily as you eat a bowl of porridge. Sam was fond of porridge, especially when it was sweetened with honey. In hanging out with Jon Snow at Castle Black, I often feel like the reader is getting some of what I refer to as the Dunning-Kramer effect. You know, in reference to that episode of Seinfeld where Kramer thinks he's a badass because he's beating up all the kids in his dojo. Except in this case, it's the reader thinking Kramer's a badass because he's beating up all the kids in his dojo. We assume that Jon is a lot better than he actually is because the competition we see him beat up so easily isn't actually very much competition. Compare Jon's 2-on-1s or 3-on-1s to, say, Garland Tyrell's 2-on-1s or 3-on-1s. Garland Tyrell, a much more experienced swordsman who has fought in many battles, is able to take on experienced knights in uneven situations. Men who have killed, who have fought, who have spent their entire lives training, like Jon. And it's kind of hard to imagine Jon taking on 2 or 3 knights at once, especially considering that when put up against a good swordsman like Mance Raider, Jon is handled quite easily. And while Jon takes the ass-whooping in stride, even he isn't delusional about the fact that it was indeed an ass-whooping. It would appear that many in the fandom have an opinion of Jon that is higher than the book series, and even higher than Jon's own opinion of himself. Now you may be wondering why I chose to read that first section in its entirety, rather than, say, chopping out a portion of it. Well, I wanted to highlight that Jon Snow is also just incredibly young. Like, he's a really young guy. He honestly hasn't had the years of life to clock in some of the crazy experience he'd need to stack up to some of the greatest sword fighters in even just Westeros, let alone the world of Ice and Fire. Now again, this doesn't mean Jon is bad. Even for Jon's neck of the woods, he says that he's a better sword fighter than Robb. But think of how few fighters these young men have encountered in their lives, say against Loras Tyrell, whose father has been pushing him into tournaments against grown men since he was even younger. And I'm not even trying to toot Sir Loras' horn super hard here. Yes, he's an example of a very skilled young fighter, but he's also not the top of the top tier in Westeros. His brother Garland is an example of someone that even he looks up to as being a lot more powerful, a lot more skilled. So I think that when people try to place Jon even within the realm of his own capability for skill, they're selling him pretty high, based on even just the years he's been alive to be able to acquire skills. Let's just say that Jon puts in the work and becomes as good of a fighter as Loras, or even better. It would still take him until his 20s probably to get to where he's as good as some of the other best names in Westeros. And that seems to be par for the course. Yeah, we get Joss Peckleton over here killing and capturing knights at the Blackwater like it ain't no thing, but typically, most of our very well-known and very well-renowned fighters are winning their honors and their names in their 20s, after they've emerged from their teenage years as cream-of-the-crop fighters. But let's pivot away from a lot of this hypothetical stuff and generalizations, and go to a time we actually see Jon throw down with a good swordsman. And I am of course referring to the infamous fight between Jon Snow and Mance Raider, the King Beyond the Wall. We know in the story that Mance Raider is a pretty cream-of-the-crop fighter. He has fought against numerous champions beyond the wall, and he was a skilled brother and renowned warrior of the Night's Watch prior to becoming King of the Wildlings. So if Jon really were to compete for a slot amongst the top fighters, at least again in Westeros, he would certainly need to prove himself to be on par with Mance Raider. However, I don't know if that can be said following the fight, but I'll let you, the listener, decide if Jon Snow is hanging 10 with Mancy Boy. Once clad in mail and plate, the Lord of Bones seemed to stand a little straighter, He seemed taller too, his shoulders thicker and more powerful than Jon would have thought. It's the armor, not the man, he told himself. Even Sam could appear almost formidable, clad hat to heel in Donalnoy's steel. The wildling waved away the shield Horse offered him. Instead, he asked for a two-handed sword. "There's a sweet sound," he said, slashing the air. "Flap a little closer, Snow. I mean to make your feathers fly." Jon rushed him hard. Rattleshirt took a step backwards and met the charge with a two-handed slash. If Jon had not interposed his shield, it might have staved his breastplate in and broken half his ribs. The force of the blow staggered him for a moment and sent a solid jolt up his arm. He hits harder than I would have thought. His quickness was another unpleasant surprise. They circled round each other, trading blow for blow. The Lord of Bones gave as good as he was getting. By rights, the two-handed greatsword should have been a deal more cumbersome than Jon's longsword, but the wildling wielded it with blinding speed. Iron Emmet's fledglings cheered their Lord Commander at the start, but the relentless speed of Rattleshirt's attacks soon beat them down to silence. He cannot keep this up for long, Jon told himself as he stopped another blow. The impact made him grunt. Even dulled, the greatsword cracked his pinewood shield and bent the iron rim. He will tire soon. He must. Jon slashed at the wildling's face, and Rattleshirt pulled back his head. He hacked down at Rattleshirt's calf, only to have him deftly with the blade. The greatsword crashed down onto Jon's shoulder, hard enough to ding his pauldron and numb the arm beneath. Jon backed away. The Lord of Bones came after, chortling. He has no shield, Jon reminded himself. And that monster sword's too cumbersome for parries. I should be landing 2 blows for every one of his. Somehow he wasn't, though, and the blows he did land were having no effect. The wildling always seemed to be moving away or sliding sideways, so Jon's longsword glanced off shoulder or an arm before he found himself giving more ground, trying to avoid the other's crashing cuts and failing half the time. His shield had been reduced to kindling. He shook it off his arm. Sweat was running down his face and stinging his eyes beneath his helm. He's too strong and too quick, he realized. And with that greatsword, he has weight and reach on me. It would have been a different fight if Jon had been armed with Longclaw, but his chance came on Rattleshirt's next backswing. Jon threw himself forward, bullying into the other man, and they went down together, legs entangled. Steel slammed on steel. Both men lost their swords as they rolled on the hard ground. The wildling drove a knee between Jon's legs. Jon lashed out with a mailed fist. Somehow, Rattleshirt ended up on top, with Jon's head in his hands. He smashed it against the ground, then wrenched his visor open. "If I had me a dagger, you'd be less than I by now," he snarled, before Horse and Iron Emmet dragged him off the Lord Commander's chest. "Let me go, you bloody crows," he roared. Jon struggled to one knee. His head was ringing, and his mouth was full of blood. He spat it out and said, "Well fought." "You flatter yourself, crow. I never broke a sweat." So first off, props to Jon for holding your own at all against an experienced fighter like that who's clearly determined to hurt you. But I would like to point out that that fight was rather one-sided. And while Mance Raider certainly is a bamf, we don't actually know that he out-bamfs some of the other serious bamfs of Westeros. And we know that the world of Ice and Fire is a lot bigger than Westeros, so the bamf meter, well, let's just say it probably goes over 9,000. At this point, some of you are probably saying, but he's Rhaegar's kid, or he's Arthur Dayne's kid, or he's somebody magical's kid, and he's a Stark, and he's a Zora High, and I mean, he's got a crazy sword. And to all of those tangential, basically unprovable ideas, I would respond, none of those things necessarily makes you a great fighter. And furthermore, none of those things necessarily makes you one of the greatest fighters in Westeros. Even if some of this is true, and Jon Snow is half Targaryen and half Stark and half Dane, and he's also part Braavosi water dancer, and he is gonna ride 2 dragons, it wouldn't necessarily make him a badass sword fighter, and it wouldn't necessarily make him highly ranked amongst badass sword fighters. I want to stress here that I'm not saying Jon is bad. I'm not even saying he's shit for his age group or training level. I think it's obvious that Jon Snow is skilled with a sword, and the fact that we learn that he was able to best Robb generally means that he obviously is pretty good for his age bracket and training level. But he's not going to fuck up Syrio Forel. He's not going to beat up Jaime. He's not going to wreck Barristan's day. He'd probably get killed by, like, the Blackfish, even though he's old. He'd certainly get murked by Bronn or the late Vardis Egan. And to be quite frank, from what we actually see of Jon Snow, I don't know how he'd stack up against a squire like Josmund Peckleton, or even a newly made knight like Sir Hugh. Well, let's face it, Peck would kill him, but there might be a series of knights out there who he could hang 10 with. That said, throw Jon in a pit with Clayton Soggs, and I don't know, man, I think Jon Snow's not walking out. So what am I saying in the end here? Well, I'm saying that Jon Snow is, again, skilled for his age level and training level. But when ranked against some of the truly great swordsmen we see in the world of Ice and Fire, he's certainly not stacking up. And this isn't shade on the boy Jon. Maybe in 10 years he will be one of the top swordsmen in the Westeros. But unfortunately, I think the fandom will be waiting even longer than for Dream of Spring for Jon to get to where he's able to throw down with the top dogs of Ice and Fire. Kind of a weird video, so thank you for sitting through it if you've managed to make it all the way to the end here. And, let me know your thoughts. Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why Jon Snow's the best in the whole world and why he's gonna ride all 3 dragons. Sexually. Or tell me why even I'm overrating him. Could little Walder Frey whoop his ass? Just let me know in the comments. Drop me a comment and tell me what you think. Thank you everybody for watching the video, and I will see you all next time.